Hi, I'm Daniel Drezner from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and I also blog at danieldrezner.com.
And I am Rob Farley. I'm from the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky, and I blog for the American Prospect and for Lawyers, Guns, and Money.
Which, by the way, I still love that title. I always think of the Warren Zevon song whenever I see that title.
I mean, it was a tribute.
Well, obviously, yes. Well, greetings from New England. It's a slightly downbeat region today because of the Super Bowl. Although I have to give credit to my fellow New Englanders. Now, I got to preface this by saying this is one of the oddities of growing up in Connecticut. While I'm a diehard Boston Red Sox fan, my father was a Giants fan growing up, and so I've been a Giants fan my entire life, so I was a little at odds with the region yesterday and quite happy today.
I mean, that's interesting, because I've always heard, and my wife is from the Bronx, and she tells me, and other people tell me, that Giants and Yankees go together, that they're considered a package.
That's certainly true of other members of my family. In my case, I was always a Giants fan. I think I got, because football I remember growing up watching with my father. And I think part of the reason I became a Red Sox fan was because there were other members of my family who shall remain nameless who were obnoxious. I don't know. The Yankee fandom just put me off, so I naturally balanced and joined Red Sox Nation, which for many, many decades I was regretting, but it's finally paid off. But I got to give New Englanders credit. I mean, I've been talking to a lot of people today, and I listen to so much sports radio in the morning, and they're disappointed clearly, but they're not bitter. They're not like we got screwed out of this game or the Giants lucked their way into the Super Bowl. I mean, everyone around here seems to think, you know what, the Giants played the better game.
Right. I mean, I've been seeing some comments, on the web and other places about how it was, sort of a boring game, but I didn't get that at all, even in the first half.
No,
it was bitterly fought.
I think. My take was the first and the fourth quarters were really, really good. I thought the middle two quarters were actually kind of sloppy. And actually, one of the plays I'm surprised no one's talked about. There was a play in the second quarter. The Giants had the ball, and it was a disastrous. It was 3-and-out for them. It was a disastrous 3-and-out. I think it was a sack. An incompletion, and then there was a play where Manning got sacked, and there was an attempted handoff to Ahmad Bradshaw. Bradshaw fumbled the ball, and it looked for certain like the Patriots were going to recover it.
Right,
but Bradshaw somehow managed to get the ball back, and I don't know when or how he did that, but that was a huge game changer because if he hadn't done it, the Patriots would have had the ball on like the Giants 20 or something, and that would have been probably another 7 points. So. But I don't know. I mean, there were some sloppy moments. Like there were a couple of Manning passes that you kind of wondered, and even Brady didn't look terribly sharp.
Well, Brady seemed really off, and it's sort of hard to tell unless you follow the game really closely about whether Brady was off or whether the receivers were changing their routes or what exactly was going on.
Part of that was because, part of that, to be credit, was the key matchup in the game. I mean, the Giants' defensive line just killed.
Oh, they were fantastic.
The Patriots' offensive line had been dominant for 18 games, and this was they cracked. And so that's certainly credit to them. But it was a great ending. That's the other thing. It was a fourth quarter that actually counted, and that's really all I ever want to see in a good Super Bowl.
Right. Right. It was a great ending. There were some fantastic plays towards the end. It was tight. I mean, even with the 35 seconds to go, it looked like the Patriots might have a chance.
I was half expecting them to drive down for the field goal.
It wouldn't be unreasonable.
Yeah, that would have been something to expect. Now, I'm curious. Did any of the ads stand out for you though?
Not so much.
Yeah.
I wasn't terribly impressed by any of them this time around. I don't know. Maybe I paid a little bit less attention this time. I didn't really care for the Panda Bear ad.
No, I thought that was really bad. The accent was terribly offensive. Frankly, it was like Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's.
Right. I mean, it's like. Suddenly we can put this accent that no Chinese Americans that I know have ever had, and it's okay if we put it in Panda Bears.
Now here's the interesting thing though. There was a Taco Bell ad that I thought was in some ways equally problematic.
I don't remember.
It was where you've got like this mariachi band in the middle of a workplace, and again it was just very stereotypical. I mean the accents were less offensive. I think the one the one ad I really liked was the Coke ad with the balloons. Did you see that one?
I don't remember.
It was very clever. It was set in New York, and it was like a parade thing. And you see these. You had Stewie from Family Guy, Underdog trying to fight for this like balloon version of the Coke bottle. It was just very cleverly done. And then in the end, the Charlie Brown balloon gets it, which was a nice sort of a nice grace note. I like the fact that
is nice.
I was half. You see Charlie Brown getting it, and I was half expecting it at some point Lucy to come out of nowhere and grab the Coke bottle, but that didn't happen. But the ads. I agree with you. The ads were on the whole underwhelming. Actually, the other good ad I liked was the one that the NFL put together about the oboe player for the Houston Texans.
Oh yeah, no, that one was
very good, but it was advertising the NFL. But this is a nice segue though, which is if the ads are going downhill, is this a sign of declining U.S. hegemony, that we're losing our creativity, as it were? See,
my segue was going to be now that Patriots hegemony has ended. What does that to say about American hegemony?
Well, you see, okay, that's an even better metaphor, because the question is, has the Patriots hegemony ended? I mean,
right.
You think they're not going to contend next year?
No, I think that they will. Exactly. But I mean, this is obviously a problem for.
There are signs of cracks in the edifice.
Exactly. There are dangers in taking these metaphors too far.
I certainly agree. Well, I have to admit, as I was thinking this morning, you could basically use the Super Bowl for a metaphor for any thing. I mean, George W. Bush could actually use this as a valedictory. Think about Eli Manning. Eli Manning is the perceived less successful son of a football grade. Never thought to have a great personality in terms of matching with his leadership, and then he comes up winning. So, even George W. Bush could potentially draw some solace from this victory.
Right. I mean, you can put any story you want on it, and which is sort of the nice thing about. Which was the nice thing about this Super Bowl too was, just. I wouldn't have been disappointed whoever won.
No, that's true. It was a good game, and I mean, as much as the Patriots didn't blow this game. I mean, they played really hard. It was just the Giants played better. And so, and I guess the other nice thing I liked about it was that in some ways it was a nice redemption moment for, we always, one of the classic concerns in sports is what about the children? What will they, what will they take away from, Spygate or baseball, the steroid scandal? And I thought one of the nice lessons of the football season this year was the fact that the Giants and the Patriots played their hearts out in the last regular season game. A game that was meaningless as far as the playoffs were concerned. But they still gave their all. They didn't rest anyone, and that was a great game too. And interestingly enough, that was probably the moment where I think you can argue the Giants, got their momentum from.
Right, and that's where everybody's arguing about the morale effect of that game, and so that's kind of interesting, sort of to look at in the future. But anyway, to American hegemony.
Right, back to American hegemony. So there's been a lot of blog chatter and public commentary about whether or not finally U.S. hegemony is on the wane. I mean, this has been predicted for, decades, let's face it, within international relations.
Yeah, 60s.
It started in the 60s. There was a cover story in the New York Times Magazine by Parag Khanna, I think, about, declining hegemony. I actually thought the picture was even better. The cover picture was a brilliant one of, the United States literally shrinking relative to its map. So, the question is, going forward, is American hegemony on the decline, and what are the implications?
Well, that's interesting. Have you read the? It's an interesting topic, which is why people keep returning to it every single year since the 1960s. Have you read the new maritime strategy, the Navy's new maritime strategy?
It's on my to-do list, but no, I have not read it. I have to confess.
The new maritime strategy didn't really sort of explicitly characterize hegemony, but it did talk about it in a pretty nuanced way, talking about hegemony as being the ability to defeat any peer competitor, but not necessarily the ability to handle all the tasks that you would want a hegemonic power to do all by itself. So hegemony in a military sense, meaning the ability to destroy any potential enemy, and hegemony in more of a leadership sense as just that, leadership rather than dominance. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, think about hegemony in those terms rather than in terms of the United States can go where it wants and do what it wants, is much more productive, right? Where the United States continues, because of its economic and military advantages, to play a very significant leadership role, but does not have the sort of dominance that some arguments about hegemony were suggested in the 1990s and early 2000s.
Well, this is one of the problems I think we have. You and I are both IR scholars. We have our PhDs in international relations, and I think this might be one of those moments where there's a mismatch between how, and this actually exposes, I think, one of the slippery qualities of the term hegemony. Because within international relations, if we think about hegemony, we're not just thinking first among equals. We're thinking, one great power significantly larger than every other potential peer competitor out there. But within the public discourse, Americans might be comfortable, with the idea of a hegemony where, again, it is first among equals. So I think part of that is, what does it mean to be the hegemon at this point? And then, of course, there's the normative fact that the word hegemony actually, I think, means different things to different people. If when we have a scholarly argument, we use the word hegemony. It doesn't have any. It's not loaded with any kind of negative.
Right, we use it in a pretty value-neutral sense.
Yeah, we use it in an incredibly value-neutral term. But I think out there, when you hear the word hegemony, it's supposed to be freighted with incredible negative implications.
Oh yeah, there's no question, and this is probably a little bit different on your blog than mine. But whenever I use the term hegemony, there is always a little bit of pushback because the commenters, well, U.S. hegemony, that's a bad thing. Well, not the way that international relations scholars think about it, right? I mean, hegemony could potentially be a bad thing, but hegemony also has a lot of potential serious upsides.
No, and I mean, this is one of these debates within international relations. I mean, there's a sort of old warhorse theory called hegemonic stability theory that basically says the provision of public goods in the global system is going to be likelier and more stable if you have a hegemon as opposed to other distributions of power. Doesn't mean that it's not possible in those other distributions of power, just much more likely for incentive-based reasons for the hegemon to do it on its own, because in providing for the public goods, it also benefits itself. So again, partially it's the hegemon. I mean, I don't think anyone would have agreed that if the Soviet Union had wound up being the hegemon at the end of the Cold War, I'm not sure the system would have been, might have been stable, but it certainly would have been.
You would have had a very different arrangement because the hegemon decides on the rules of the game.
Exactly.
Right, or largely determines the rules of the game.
Right.
So you would have had some of the stability.
And this is interesting because among IR scholars, if we do draw normative implications, one of the normative implications you draw frequently is that in fact a hegemonic system isn't that bad of a system in terms of both openness and stability, assuming you've got a rising hegemon. But this obviously breeds other issues. When you start debating it popularly. I mean, I guess the question I've got, or the issues I've got with some of the arguments out there is that there is evidence that the U.S. is relatively speaking not doing as well as it used to. China is growing at an incredible rate. The European Union is got a relatively unique way of expanding its size. And this is sort of a novel innovation, which is it can just gobble up countries if it wants to.
Right. Well, it's a return to certain older modes of expansion, but with a new twist.
Yeah,
right?
But with a twist of it's voluntary. And voluntary not in a nonchalant way, but in a real way. But and so there's certainly arguments about the U.S. and relative.
Wait, India, you have to mention India.
Oh, I forgot India. Yes, of course. India certainly. They've managed to clearly exceed their Hindu rate of growth. So, on the one hand, the world does seem to be shifting, in a multipolar direction. And there are ways in which I think that trend will happen in the short term because, the U.S. had a massive productivity surge from about 95 to recently. And it would not be surprising for other countries to start growing more, in essence, because they get to play free catch-up, as they technologically catch up. But, I think declining, sort of declinist, for lack of a better way of putting this term. Part of the problem, I think, among IR people we've got is that we're a little skeptical of this because we've been down this road many times before.
Right.
In the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of arguments made in the Academy saying the U.S. is on the wane. The Bretton Woods era has ended. Clearly the U.S. can't.
Well, even in the popular imagination, the Paul Kennedy book is really important in this, and that was more than just IR.
Yeah, that's true.
Or the professional international relations theorists. That was sort of a much larger reach, but they made the same sort of arguments.
Right, and interestingly enough, I still remember because Kennedy 5 years ago wrote something where I thought, because that was when he wrote that the U.S. is clearly the preeminent superpower and never has a state been as powerful as the United States is now. And I flashed back 20 years and remembered, oh crap, because whenever Kennedy says something, the opposite happens.
Isn't Japan supposed to have passed us by now?
According to some, yes, that's certainly true.
Now, what do you think? I proposed this a couple days ago. Sort of connecting the 95 growth spurt. Of the United States, and really, even a little bit before then, in terms of relative growth of the Japanese, that sort of helped produce a hothouse for a neoconservative conception of the world. In other words, those theories were out there. But after 95, in which the United States is experiencing this surge of growth, this surge of power, it made those theories, at least for a short term, more plausible. It made Crystal and Kagan's case a little bit more plausible when it really did seem like suddenly the United States could beat all comers and everyone was falling behind.
I would say, to give the neoconservatives a little more credit, it's not just that there was that relative increase in U.S. power in the 90s. It was also how the Cold War ended. And I think this is sometimes something that people overlook when they think about neoconservatives, which is the Cold War ended largely on American terms. It ended because Gorbachev was willing to try to reform the Soviet system, and eventually it collapsed on its own weight. But the key thing is that, the Reagan administration certainly went out of its way to sign treaties with the Soviet Union. But if you actually looked at the terms being negotiated under both Reagan and Bush, essentially the U.S. got almost everything it wanted.
Right.
It handed large amounts of cash to the Soviets, but Germany stayed within NATO. Eastern Europe was decoupled from the Soviet Empire. The Soviet Union eventually Gorbachev talked about democratic values. I think for neoconservatives then, the message to draw from this, the lesson to draw from this was, Reagan's strategy worked. You talk tough, you don't compromise, you make them come to you, and then once they come to you, some neoconservatives would disagree on this, that's when you were willing to cut the deals. But you cut the deals on your terms. And so I suspect that it was easy for neoconservatives, particularly in a post-9/11 world, to apply the Cold War mentality to dealing with radical Islam. The belief that it's a similar kind of ideology that will fail and fall under its own weight, and all we need to do is endure and persist. Or in some ways, the neocons I think had an even more aggressive posture, as you point out, because the radical Islamists are not the same as the Soviet Union. They didn't have nuclear weapons. They weren't a real power. So the U.S. could actually go on the offensive. And clearly that strategy has proven disastrous.
Right. But even before, before 2001, it's Crystal and Kagan and so forth. They aren't thinking just about the radical Islam.
No, they were thinking about China as well. That's true.
Yeah, they're thinking about China and thinking about restructuring the world even before then on the American model, right? And without so many of the institutions that, to get the conversation back to the 1970s and 1960s discussion of hegemony, without all the institutions that everybody was telling us we needed to manage American decline.
Okay, but to be fair, it wasn't just the neoconservatives who argued this. John Eikenberry has made this point, that it was not surprising that the U.S. was acting this way because its relative power was increasing. You would therefore expect them to want to rejigger institutions in a way that conform more closely to their interests. So, I agree with you that the neoconservatives supplied the ideas that made this possible, but there were other logics at work, I think.
No, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Back to the original question about whether American hegemony. My sense is that the continued economic predominance of the United States, the continued the fact that the United States remains absolutely critical, and the health of the United States remains absolutely critical to the growing Chinese economy and the growing European economies, and especially U.S. military power, which is not going, which is apparently growing as well. It's hard for me to envision a world, up to the very end of my lifetime, in which the United States is not still the first among equals and does not still have the most substantial say in the rules of the game.
Well, I think you have to talk about two things. The first is trends versus snapshots. If you take a snapshot of what happened in the last month, that actually suggests that, in fact, the U.S. remains the hegemon. Consider what happened. You see faltering U.S. growth, and worldwide you've got, panic in capital markets. Mm-hmm. And then what happens? The Fed lowers, cuts interest rates by total, 1.25 points, I think, in two separate instances. And suddenly the markets, they're not great, but they stabilized. And this is a classic, providing, global public goods. This is countercyclical lending. It's what Charles Kindleberger talked about. So the fact that it worked, at least in the short term, suggests that the U.S. still remains the hegemonic actor. Now, in terms of trends, there's a reason why I think you've got all this lost hegemony or vanishing hegemony talk, which is, the trends do indicate that the U.S. isn't doing absolutely bad, but relatively speaking, China's growing, at a relatively robust rate, and there are ways in which Europe is still going to be a salient actor. So, and India as well. So, I do think you're eventually going to see a shift towards a multipolar world, but I don't think it's happening quite as quickly as people like Khan and others want it to happen for their book sales.
Well, and there's one other point to make too, which is that the experience of hegemony in the 1920s and the 1930s. It's not enough that the world changes, right? There has to be a decisive act on the part of some actor to rewrite the rules of the game. Which is why the zombie of British hegemony extended well into the 30s and even a bit into the 40s. And so,
that was part of the problem. The problem, this is something I'm working on in my next book, is that the problem you had in the interwar period was there was a mismatch between the distribution of power in the world and the distribution of power in terms of running the actual regimes that mattered. So you had a situation where Great Britain was, falling rapidly, and yet it was still in charge of essentially maintaining the gold standard.
No, that's my point.
Okay, all right,
that's my point. Right. And so, even to the extent that we envision a world that's sort of in an objective sense multipolar, with a number of big economic actors, the United States may be first, or may eventually be second. There still at some point has to be an active decision on the part of some actor to change the rules of the game,
right?
To shift the hegemon out of the hegemonic position.
Yeah, John Eikenberry had an interesting essay in the latest issue of Foreign Affairs where he argues that even if China is rising, it's not going to matter, because his claim is that China, will basically embrace this sort of setup that the U.S. imposed. I think John's being a little overly optimistic, but that's certainly a valid line of argumentation.
Right. They have their foreign policy has suggested over the past 15 years that they are not interested in rewriting the game. That they're not interested in any sort of global hegemony. But 10 years down the road, when they're who knows if they're it's an industry to predict that Chinese growth will stop at some point, and eventually somebody's going to be right, I suppose. 10 years down the road, if they've continued to grow, then their foreign policy may change.
I think it will. My take on China is that in some ways, the analogy I think of is roughly 1890s United States, where, if you remember, historically this is when the U.S. rises to hegemonic status, but it's not like the rise was a seamless, uninterrupted increase in terms of economic growth. There were some serious, it was the 1893 recession, which was the most serious downturn in U.S. economic history. It wouldn't shock me if China experiences a fair number of hiccups as it continues to grow, but at the same time, the long-term trajectory, I think, is still undeniable.
Right, and another interesting thing about the U.S. experience during that period was that the military hegemony really followed the economic.
That's correct,
and it followed the economic at some distance. And the U.S. was not the premier military power into the 30s, for a very long time.
No, in the 30s, at one point, I think our Navy was smaller than Greece's.
Right. I'm not sure about that, but Hoover at one point boasted that we had an army smaller than any army in Europe.
Right.
Which is a curious boast from a Republican.
Well, those
curious. Not for a Republican at the time, but curious in hindsight. Fascinating in hindsight, I guess is a better word.
Yes. I guess So I think we're in rough agreement in terms of going forward about U.S. hegemony, which is that it's not going away anytime soon, and even if it does, even if you do see a shift towards a multipolar distribution of power, there's still going to be a de facto recognition of the U.S. as the leader in the system until there is some kind of crisis or shock that, God forbid, will not happen. Right. Now we can get to the other, sort of fun part about the Kahneman piece in particular, which was, as I think I put it on my blog. It was written kind of like Benjamin Barber after a 3-day coke bender in Macau.
That's a classic line. That's really, it's fantastic.
And I apologize to Kana, for perhaps being slightly nasty, but the writing was just incredibly off-putting. But I guess to be fair to him, it's not like he's the only one guilty of this. Open up a Tom Friedman book and it's just as bad. Barber is, Barber was the reason. There was a reason why I used his name. Mm-hmm. Do you think it is possible to write a book that is accessible to a wider audience for international relations, but actually write it well, as opposed to writing it where it's so overtly trying to be popular that it winds up being off-putting?
This is a really interesting question. I guess to start off with, I'll completely agree with you on Kana that I found the writing extremely off-putting, and I also found the ideas uninspiring. That they're, this is because we're IR people, I guess.
And we should say, in a nutshell, what Kana is arguing is that we're shifting to a tripolar distribution of power, where China, the United States, and the EU are sort of the big poles, and then what he calls the second world, which consists of sort of middle powers, will get to play everyone off each other, and it'll be a contest to see who can get them
And I don't think he used the word Japan anywhere in that excerpt.
Yeah,
which,
no, he didn't.
In
India, he sort of brushed aside. Russia, he brushed aside. There was a whole variety of things that were factually just really off about the essay.
Right. So I was troubled by the content. I was troubled by the writing. Yeah, I guess one thing I'm really looking forward to. I'm very interested in what Iglesias puts together. I'm interested in what his book is going to look like, since he's going to be writing on these issues, and he's going to be writing from a popular perspective. But he's a smart guy, and so I'm curious about what he's going to produce. But you know what? You're right. There's a lot of these books that are just really, really bad. I read Strobe Talbot's new book, which I believe is called The Great Experiment, and it's just not very good.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just there's a lot of noodling about the creation of the state and empires to states and so forth. It's really boring, and then there's some sort of mildly interesting anecdotes from his time in the White House, and that's it. And that's what goes for his discussion of international relations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one was reviewed along with... I just read John Bolton's book, actually, for some research. And I have to say, Bolton's book is a little different. I actually like the book, not because I really agreed with Bolton, but because the man has a chip on his shoulder the size of Montana. And so, I mean, every single encounter in that book is Bolton either being right or, some lily-livered person in the State Department finally admitting, John Bolton, you were right and I was wrong, or I guess I'm going to agree with you on this one. And, I mean, it's just, it was stunning how much, it was stunning how much this man clearly disliked everyone that he worked with. Is the only way I can put it.
Yeah, you see, that would be so refreshing compared to the Talbot, because Talbot would, give these anecdotes. Oh, I played chess with Charles Krautheimer every other week, and he always wins, but we're such good friends. But he's this terrible neocon who's wrong about everything.
It was
just
it was. But in that sense, I guess I actually enjoyed the Bolton book because it was so revealing of Bolton's personality, and also he actually does dish dirt, so that's useful. But as a vision for the world, no, it's a piece of crap. There's no other way to put it.
Another way to think about it is think about it the other way too. In terms of. Again, we've said this a few times, we come at this from academics, and so a lot of what appears in these books seems really old to us. But the other part of that question is, why aren't academics producing really interesting popular books?
No, that's a fair point.
I mean, if you go back, Politics Among Nations is an entirely readable book.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a mess, theoretically, in a lot of ways, but it's a readable book.
Yeah.
And Man, the State, and War is a fun, readable book in a way that, theory of
I wouldn't go that
isn't.
far. I really like the book. I wouldn't describe it as readable to a general audience, but...
No, it's not bad.
It's certainly not bad. It's certainly more accessible than Waltz's Theory of International Politics. I grant you that.
Right.
But, I mean, this does... I mean, I guess I am a little worried... We're going to sound snobbish. I mean, I still remember... I went to some sort of event... when I was still in Chicago, and it was someone, basically making a popular, argument about world politics, and I was getting more and more irked because, I'd heard all these arguments before, and at one point, I was talking with someone else who was not an academic, he, was a businessman, and we were just sort of chatting, and he turned to me and says, you don't realize how lucky you are, because you get to hear this stuff, day in, day out. For someone like me who doesn't think about these things day in and day out, this is fresh. And, that's a valid point. But it does raise the question of whether or not any academic... You're right. I mean, you would think that academics who have been well-versed in these ideas would actually then be able to make popular versions of the arguments. I mean...
Right. I mean, Mearsheimer, that's sort of what Mearsheimer tried to do with Tragedy of Great Power Politics.
Yes.
Right, was to turn a series of academic disputes into an interesting popular book.
Right. Although that's also a good theoretical book as well. I mean, you're right. And that got better. I mean, that did get more play. I mean, I think the maybe it's Mearsheimer. I mean, Huntington was the best at this. You could argue. I mean, certainly. I mean, not his last book was really bad. Who Is Us? But even Clash of Civilizations was a book that clearly touched a nerve, and was written in a very accessible way.
Right.
But I'm trying to think since Huntington, if anyone's written anything that you would point to and say, see, here's a book that someone who's not an IR specialist can still read and really, learn something from.
Right, yeah, I'd have to give that some thought.
We'll ask the commenters.
And we actually have to give that some thought. I mean, I don't know if you guys have a summer reading list where you guys are, but we actually look for these really popular books that a lot of people are going to have read to give to our students here.
Why, Rob, did I mention that All Politics is Global is going to be available in paperback in August?
No, you didn't, but that sounds like a fantastic opportunity.
It's got a pithy title, if nothing else.
Extremely pithy.
No, but I mean, you know what? We'll put it to the audience, the commenters at Blogging Heads. If they can come up with popular but good books about international relations, post them in the comments. I'm curious to see if you come up with anything good. It's got to be since '93. So Clash of Civilizations, Clash of Civilizations came out in '96, so it's got to be post '96.
Post '96. That's fair. That's a fair challenge.
I think that is a worthy challenge. Okay, well, we should switch from sort of more academic discussions of hegemony to whether or not anything that Speaking of bad writing, as someone who's had to read most of the foreign affairs essays by the candidates about what their foreign policy visions are going to be, suddenly Kana doesn't look that bad. At least Kana is making interesting and provocative, I think wrong, but provocative arguments, whereas a lot of these essays have just been pure pablum.
Right, and even the ones that, you really loathed Giuliani's, if I recall.
I loathed Giuliani's, and I loathed Huckabee's. I actually loathed more. Huckabee's was just incoherent.
You didn't like Edwards either.
I didn't like it. No, I didn't like Edwards. Those were the three that I disliked the most by far.
Well, Giuliani's wasn't so much pap as it just was frightening, if I recall. And that's
correctly. My point. As I said, I actually disliked Huckabee's more. Huckabee's was incoherent. Giuliani's, I strongly disagreed with, but I understood the ideas, and it was relatively clear. I just thought he was wrong. Edwards was. If you use the word re-engage one more friggin' time, I just wanted to take a polo mallet to the essay. I mean, it was just, pounding me. But even the ones that weren't that, if they weren't bad, they were just, boring. I mean, the Romney essay was mostly boring. The Obama essay was mostly boring. I thought the Clinton and McCain ones were better. But even those were, okay.
Right, it's a strange thing because they're designed to be boring, and at the same time they're aimed at such a small portion of the voting public.
Right.
The number of people who are first going to start reading these and then interpret all the differences between exactly what is the difference between Edwards, Obama, and Clinton on these questions here. And sometimes the space is non-existent, and sometimes there are nuggets and so forth. So you're talking to such a tiny amount of people that almost the point of these essays is not to say something crazy. I mean, you have to write the essay, but you just can't say anything that anybody's going to disagree with.
But I mean, I guess there's two ways. I mean, you're right. In some ways, the people who have to write these essays, and the candidates don't write these essays, it's their foreign policy advisors. Right. They are in a tough box because if they say anything controversial, it doesn't matter that only a small sliver of people read it. It'll get it'll get more widely advertised. For example, in the Huckabee essay, when he accused the Bush administration of having a bunker mentality, the Romney campaign jumped all over that before the Iowa caucuses and started, trumpeting that to everyone. And so I was in the weird position of being quoted in a Romney attack, which was bizarre, but I suppose a compliment. But still, I mean, you would think there would be interesting ideas. I mean, for example, I'll give Romney credit. He actually had an interesting idea, which, interestingly enough, Kana also put in his essay, which is Romney proposed in terms of reorganizing U.S. foreign policy that he thinks that, there should be a civilian counterpart to the military sort of, sync system. That the military organizes the world by regions. Right. And there is one, a single commander that's basically in charge of all military forces in that region, and they're almost like a viceroy.
Right, the combatant commanders.
Right, exactly. And Romney's approach was basically, why can't you do that on the civilian side as well? And that's an interesting idea. I mean, I don't know if it would work well.
And I don't remember the essay in particular, but was he proposing putting this under the State Department?
Yes.
Yeah. Which is sort of interesting in and of itself, and I wonder, and I never read all the criticism of it, but I wonder how that flew among a lot of these very conservative circles that have always understood the State Department, to be a very threatening or a very troublesome element.
My guess is they were fine with it because the implication was Romney was going to be reorganizing the State Department. If I'm Romney, the easy way to spin this is, well, I'm going to finally, cut through the fog at Foggy Bottom and,
finally beat down the State Department.
Exactly. I'm going to organize it the way I want. But regardless of that, on the merits, there was that's an interesting idea. So I've got to give Romney credit on that. Similarly, Hillary Clinton had made a valid point. She's done this in the debates also about if you're going to pull out of Iraq, you also have to take care of the Iraqis that helped the United States. That's again, that's showing higher thought and some imagination. McCain in his essay was adamant about pushing Latin America and about using free trade agreements as a way to bolster ties. Again, that I'm certainly sympathetic to that. And actually, the Obama essay was also dull. I mean, he didn't have many ideas at all, actually. So, I guess, do you think it's possible to run? The first question, I guess, is does any of this matter?
Well, I mean, if your second question was, is it possible to write these that aren't dull? Yeah, Juliana proves so, but it also proves you probably shouldn't.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
And the second, does any of this really matter? And I'm skeptical. I'm pretty. This is something that comes in for a lot of conversation, especially in the left-wing blogosphere when we talk about differences, because everybody's still trying to figure out Clinton or Obama.
Yeah.
And it always comes down to the war, right? How much should we care about the war? Right. And how much should we care about the advisors and so forth?
Yeah, Matt Iglesias and others have been blogging a lot about how, can you parse out the advisors, the advisors for one campaign better than the advisors for another? And is there ideological space between them?
Right, and and some talk about the Obama campaign, in which he has sort of he has a very wide range of advisors. He has Samantha Power and a few other people who have some pretty interesting thinkers.
Right. He also has Tony Lake and Susan Rice.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so the conclusion that I come to in the end is that I guess it's really hard for me to say, because you have to play a counterfactual. Let's say that somehow McCain pulls it out in 2000, and so we have a Republican president who's not George Bush. Does our foreign policy differ significantly?
Yeah, I would think. I think it would, but
right. I suspect that. Well, I suspect it would be similar in form and slightly more competent in content.
Yeah.
Now, then, from that sort of observation, from that thought, what can you then take back to, these small distinctions inside the parties?
I guess so, but again, the 2000 campaign is illustrative of the question whether or not it matters. If you looked at what Bush said during the campaign, and I should know because I was part of his team at this point, very, very small, minor, unpaid cog of the team, what he said during the campaign did not necessarily bear a great deal of resemblance to what he did even before 9/11.
Oh no! Yeah, no question.
So he's talking about being humble in terms of foreign policy.
Right.
We don't want to engage in nation building. Clearly what we wound up doing looked very different. So, now to be fair, part of that is 9/11. That really does change how people thought about foreign policy. And I don't know. I'll for the sake of argument, I'll take the opposite position, which is these things do matter because, having worked in the government. These things actually usually wind up as blueprints for how people are going to think about foreign policy, at least for the first couple of years of an administration, in part because if you actually get elected, you've got to look at whatever you've written in the past. It's almost a path dependence issue. And there are times where if you make campaign pledges about foreign policy, you actually have to fulfill them. Everyone
when are those times?
Well, take the steel tariff business from the Bush administration. That was the Bush administration executed steel tariffs in 2002. The reason he did that was because he promised West Virginia. He made a promise in West Virginia saying, "If you elect me, I'll do this," and he did. I don't think George. I don't think he wanted to, or I don't think.
I think you're right. I think it was electorally driven, whether it was backward-looking or forward-looking. Either way.
And I think certainly pledges on Iraq, one way or the other, are also, I can see the candidates getting, let me put it this way, it's not so much overarching visions as being really situations where a candidate is locked in, but if they make specific pledges on foreign policy, I do think they get trapped by their own rhetoric sometimes.
Right, which is why they are so careful not to do so unless they know they're not going to win the election, like Richardson.
Or Paul,
Right, exactly.
But if McCain gets quoted saying we're going to be there 50 or 100 years, what have you, and I do think I think it got twisted a little out of context. But the point is, that's going to be the signature or the way in which McCain is associated in Iraq.
Well, it's going to matter in the campaign, but I'm not sure that it's going to transform how McCain would actually. I suppose I suppose it might foreclose the option of a Nixon-style withdrawal from Vietnam, so that when he's talking about being in Iraq for 50 or 100 years, maybe that's off the table.
Yeah, Iraqification is off the table. I would agree.
Right.
That's probably going to be a Democratic strategy if it is implemented.
Right. I suspect that's true, and I suspect that it will be largely the same regardless of whether it's Obama or Clinton. But, I mean, you're right that, and you go back to before, we talked about, and Iglesias harps on this too, about the advisors, that the advisors matter, that the people that the advisors install matter, and sometimes these are going to be the same people regardless of who the nominee is.
Yes, although I do think this is where I do think the gap between Obama and Clinton will make a difference. Because let's face it, if Clinton gets elected, her Secretary of State is going to be Dick Holbrooke. Right. Dick Holbrooke is not going to be the Secretary of State in an Obama administration.
Right.
And that does make a difference, because Holbrooke is a polarizing figure to some extent within the Democratic Party. The line I'm actually surprised, I guess the Clinton campaign can't use this overtly, but the one thing I'm shocked about that no one has said is that the principal Obama advisors primarily were involved with the Clinton administration in the first term. And to be blunt, the first term of the Clinton administration is not covered with glory when it comes to foreign policy successes.
It's not well regarded. It's not well remembered even from the second time.
Exactly.
The
second term generally conceived of as being much, much better, but the first term, no.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I'm actually surprised no one's made that argument against the Obama team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's interesting, and I haven't heard that. But
maybe it's a subtle point. The Clinton people can't say that, but I mean I'm surprised other surrogates haven't done that line, as opposed to the sort of idealistic versus pragmatic argument.
Right. Yeah. Sort of on the same vein, and we talked a little bit about this. In terms of, and I guess is extending this argument or this discussion about. This discussion about campaign posturing to the issue of grand strategy,
right.
Which is it possible for a candidate to put forth a grand strategy and actually to pursue that strategy, and consequently then for the United States to pursue a grand strategy for any extended period of time? And I know you've written a little bit about grand strategy.
Yeah, and I'm going to be hosting a conference on policy planning in May, or not in May. I'm sorry, in April. That is going to be in part dealing with this question on whether or not we can impose a grand strategy. It's a tough. I think part of the problem is we're compromised by how the Bush administration has spectacularly failed at this. Mm-hmm. In that they've certainly implemented. They devised a grand strategy and they implemented it. The problem is that I don't even think John McCain is going to implement. Is going to maintain the status quo in terms of grand strategy. Mm-hmm. Right. And one of the puzzles about the Bush administration on this is that if
the only one I think who would have maintained the strategy is Rudy.
Yeah,
Rudy. I mean, Rudy was very clear about maintaining the sort of the most aggressive aspects of the strategy.
Right. But one of the truly puzzling aspects about this is that if you actually read, I read the March 2006 grand strategy. Mm-hmm. The Bush administration, at least someone writing this, was aware that for that grand strategy to work, it had to be a generations-long effort. Mm-hmm. That you actually needed to commit to trying to democratize, places like Iraq, which are not going to be easy to democratize. Mm-hmm. It's a generations-long effort. To commit to a generations-long effort requires bipartisan consensus.
Right.
And that's the part of the equation I think the Bush administration never figured out. And it'll be interesting. I think part of this is, it's a debate about whether or not foreign policy has become, for all the talk about increased partisanship, does that apply to foreign policy as well? I think you could certainly argue over the last, 15 years or so that foreign policy has become a more partisan issue.
Right, I think that you're right.
But the question is does it have to stay that way, or can it be reversed by either a McCain or an Obama or a Clinton?
Right. And of course, there's a great deal of bipartisan. When we're thinking back about grand strategies the United States has pursued in the past, right, for a generations-long effort, mm-hmm. the immediate example is containment.
Right. Yeah. Of course.
The United States set forth a strategy of containment and basically followed it all the way to 1989. Mm-hmm. But I wonder two things. The first is it just that when we look back, we see containment when at the time, in fact, a lot of different presidents, a lot of different people were pursuing a bunch of different policies that were kind of, at somewhere between abject surrender and invading the Soviet Union, but were actually quite different from one another, and only look like containment in hindsight. Mm. And the second is, weren't the structural imperatives for containment so determinative that you can't really expect, especially with the United States in a hegemonic position, you can't really expect that kind of consistency across time in the future?
No, that's certainly a possibility. I mean, this again might be a situation where you can argue that in fact, a relative decline in the U.S. might actually focus the mind. But I have to admit, this might be an instance where it actually does matter who's president, and less the party but the personality. where I do think that someone like a McCain or someone like an Obama, or even someone like Clinton, because Clinton, for all her divisiveness on foreign policy, is relatively centrist, might be able to sort of cobble out enough of a coalition where, whoever gets president, their party will endorse it, and you'll have significant components of the other party. You'll have the Vandenbergs or the Bob Doles that are willing to...
You might have enough of a hangover from the Bush administration that even with the Democratic president, that, you have... I guess that makes it more likely for Obama or Clinton than for McCain, where you might still have the fights of the Bush administration hanging over into the rest. But
maybe. Let's face it. It depends on how Congress is struck. On how what happens in Congress. And again, this is partly the relatively different appeals of the candidates. Presumably, this is an area where Obama, again, constantly campaigning as a uniter, might actually be able to succeed in a way that Clinton might not be. I'm not sure.
Right. Right. We'll see. George Bush campaigned as a uniter too. So.
That is correct.
Did that work out? I think. This sort of leads into our conversation, naturally almost, about Republicans for Obama.
Yes.
That
rare breed.
My take on this is just straightforward. Hillary hatred has made them hate Hillary and therefore say good things about Obama.
I wouldn't go that far. This is where Peter Wehner had a good piece in the Washington Post. He's a former deputy in the George W. Bush. Sort of writing about why it is that Republicans are, at least speak favorably of Obama. They're not going to agree with him on a lot, but, they don't... You're right, the distaste for Obama there is none, as opposed to strong, problems with Hillary. Part of it is because he's running against the Clintons. No question. And what's interesting, I think, let's face it, is that part of what, the sort of nastiness of the South Carolina part of the campaign brought out is that, suddenly Democrats realized a lot of the things that Republicans have been saying about the Clintons for years, which is they're relentless, they'll do nothing, they'll stop at nothing to win, and so on and so forth. So that's part of it. There's no question. But I think it goes beyond that. I do think partly it's Obama's rhetoric where he doesn't. The thing that Obama doesn't do that a lot of Democrats do is that Obama actually takes the Republicans seriously. He disagrees with them, but he doesn't, dismiss their ideas. Or I guess is the best way I can put it. He can disagree without being divisive, and that's a political gift, and it comes from someone who, at a minimum, respects the other side, I guess. And I should say this as someone who's a Republican who actually is intrigued by Obama, certainly.
Right. And not for strategic reasons.
And not for strategic reasons, no, because I wasn't thrilled with the foreign affairs essay. But I think there's a third thing, and I think this actually flowed directly from the South Carolina victory speech he gave, which was a great speech. But he actually touches on a conservative trope in that speech. He talks about the idea of treating, of a rejection of standard identity politics. Remember that what the Clinton people had been trying to do up to South Carolina was paint Obama as a Jesse Jackson the sequel, a black candidate representing only African Americans. And Obama in his acceptance speech said, I believe in an America where, just because you're a woman, you don't have to vote for Hillary Clinton, or just because you're an African American, you don't have to vote for me. He didn't use those words, but it was that sentiment, and that's a conservative message. That is a message that appeals to a lot of.
Well, it is, but it's also a necessary message. Both sort of that message and the Jackson commentary.
Yeah.
Were both necessary reaction. Not necessary, but likely reactions to the outcome of South Carolina, right? Where Obama had to suggest, well, no, really, I will be a president for everyone,
right,
and I can, win everywhere, and so it's not just about this. These
right.
people voting for me, whereas the Clintons wanted to paint exactly the opposite. So, I guess I'm more inclined to think about it in terms of specific reactions to the events in South Carolina, rather than try to draw a larger narrative out of that.
I would disagree with you in two ways. You're right that Obama. Of course, it's in Obama's interest to sell, his win in that way. But the fact is that doesn't mean, therefore, that conservatives are going to look at it and think, oh, he's being disingenuous. I think Obama genuinely does think that, to some extent. So I think that is appealing for conservatives.
Right, and even if he were being disingenuous, by the fact of, the message matters, right? And that's why people say things.
And again, I think the Clinton attempt to use the Jesse Jackson line, I actually don't think the Clintons handled South Carolina awfully. And I think it's going to pay actually, as people read this today, even though we're recording this on Monday. But the second thing, though, is that there was I think a Velo conspiracy post that made this point very well, which is the U.S. combines both the head of state and the head of government, features. Other countries it's split. I think Republicans would disagree, not violently, but disagree vehemently with Barack Obama over most of the head of government aspects of the job. Mm-hmm. But I think where Republicans would give Obama, they acknowledge Obama's gifts, is he would be a great head of state. That's where he actually does well. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen a Republican discount, Obama's gifts as an orator or as a politician, or as a potential leader.
They haven't. But what does that mean exactly? I mean, the most talented orator and politician of our generation is Bill Clinton, and that didn't seem to matter at the time. But I guess many of the criticisms of Clinton, and it's almost the opposite. Whereas Clinton in head of government,
was a good head of government,
DLC and so forth, had some head of government that actually were much closer to Republican preferences. Mm-hmm. Whereas of head of state, the main criticisms were about Clinton as head of state.
Right. Although
in spite of his oratory and political skills.
No, and that's I think that's true. So you're right. Once we get to the general election, if Obama wins, and we'll talk about that in a second, you're right. I think the GOP love will not be sustained. There's it's going to be a partisan election, but I'm not sure it's going to be as nasty as past election. I do think there will be a residual effect from the way Obama has run his primary campaign.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's one of the for the Hillary people. That's one of the selling points of Hillary, that there will be no residual good feelings.
That's true.
That'll be exactly the opposite.
Although I'm not sure that's really a selling point for her. Because look, as a Republican, the one thing Hillary Clinton's going to do is that it doesn't matter who the GOP nominee is going to be. Mm-hmm. A Hillary Clinton nominee will get out the vote on the Republican side, because if for no other reason, what's happened in the primaries reminded Republicans of why they didn't like Hillary. As I was talking about this at a radio debate, someone was asking if people didn't like Hillary, because of gender issues, and I said, the Republicans don't dislike Hillary because she's a woman; they dislike her because she's a Clinton.
Right, but I'm not sure I would go that far, because part of the disdain for the Clintons has always, since the very first day, been the partnership in their marriage.
Yeah,
right? That marriage issues from just on an almost visceral level. And I recall, and this is way back 1992, and I was a Republican when I was 18 years old.
Why, Rob? I had no idea. Okay.
Yeah, it's shocking. And I went to one meeting of the University of Oregon campus Republicans. Believe it or not, such an institution exists.
Right.
And it was right after the election, and it was nothing. It was just Hillary loathing. That was it. Right, just 2 hours of people spilling how much they hated Hillary. And I think that it was because that there was something about that marriage that really irritated people. Something about how that marriage was constructed.
Well,
so that's why you have Hillary, Clinrod, and all this comment.
Okay, I got to say though, as a conservative, or as someone who's still a Republican, there's a reason why that marriage, still great, and it actually relates to what is the source of authority in government. Part of the problem with Hillary Clinton when she was First Lady was she gets assigned health care. The problem is that she had no official constitutional role or no, official title to do this. And it creates awkwardness. Hell, Dick Cheney is the vice president. He actually has a constitutional position. But his intrusion on the foreign policy-making process was nothing short of disastrous. Hillary's was worse in some ways because of the murky quality of her, her authority, which was primarily the fact that she was married to Bill Clinton. And if nothing else, the South Carolina, primary and sort of Bill Clinton shooting off the mount has reminded everyone, if you thought it was bad when they were in office in the 90s, what the hell do you do with a Bill Clinton who is the first husband? Right. And I think that's a valid objection to raise.
Right, and I think this dispute is, to some point to some extent about the question of form or content. Right, and I think there's a little bit of both. I think even the Clintons sort of acknowledged that after South Carolina, when everybody was saying, well, Bill's going to pull a little bit back now, and he's just going to, he's going to let Hillary run in the front. So yeah, I think you're right that there are some legitimate concerns about that and some legitimate irritations about that. But I also think the content of who Hillary was and the role that she played in the marriage sort of graded on traditional sensibilities.
I will concede that point. You're right. That was also there. But I do think that the institutional issue is still going to, in other words, it wasn't just a case of Hillary Clinton being, some uppity woman or, or trying to challenge traditional values. It was also the question of how do you determine whether or not a spouse has, authority in the White House? And I think this is going to be a problem multiplied several times over if Hillary Clinton becomes the president, because certainly you could, whatever you say about the partnership, Bill Clinton is much more undisciplined than Hillary, and unfortunately he was president before, so he might, get used to the perquisites of power. Right.
It creates an issue.
Yeah, so I think it's a valid issue to raise, and I'm actually surprised that again, it's something that's been brought up, a little bit, but not that part of it has not come up, and I'm a little surprised by that.
Well, we should move forward here too.
Yes.
Right? What I think is the last thing, which is the Super Tuesday, the thing we're immediately going to be humiliated on.
Yes. Now we're recording this on Monday, the 4th, but I believe this will go live on the 5th, actually during Super Tuesday. So
that is the expectation.
This is a chance for political scientists to make perfect asses of themselves by using our powers of prognostication to determine what's going to happen. So
in fairness, we're not Americanists. We're not voting behavior specialists. How really should we know?
That's true. But to the general audience, we're political scientists. You're at if you're at a cocktail party, without academics, and you say you're a political scientist, what's the first thing people ask you?
I tell them I'm a blogger.
That's even worse, though. Then they'll definitely ask you about politics.
Right.
All right, Rob, you want to kick off? What do you think is going to happen?
Okay. Well, I guess and I don't even know if this is going out on a limb. I think that Obama is going to win Connecticut. I think he's going to win Massachusetts, Alabama, Georgia, Colorado. I think he, in the end, is going to win California in spite of the early voting that favors Clinton. And I think he's going to come away with more delegates on the Democratic side. Mm-hmm. Just from Super Tuesday, he's going to come away with more delegates.
So you think he'll beat Clinton on actual delegate count?
He will beat Clinton in actual delegates on Super Tuesday. Uh-huh. I think McCain is going to crush Romney tomorrow. I think it's going to be... And the Republican side, I think it's essentially all over after tomorrow. Romney may stay in. The Democrats are going to keep going. Whether it's close on one side or the other.
The thing that makes me nervous about making predictions is that, let's face it, the polls have been off dramatically this year.
Yes.
And, the prediction markets, I had a thing on NPR about this. The prediction markets do a nice job of sort of assessing conventional wisdom, but they don't do, I'm not sure their powers of prognostication, but I'm actually fighting against that because I was looking at InTrade right before we got on. There's been a 10-point swing in Obama's direction today. He was trading at about 38 before, and now he's trading at around 50.
Oh, wow.
I agree with you. I think that what's going to happen tomorrow is that Obama's going to hold his own. I agree with you, I guess, is that he's going to... he might not equal Clinton's count, but he's going to come close. And this is the important thing. If he does that, he wins the nomination. Because after Super Tuesday, the primary campaign, sort of slows down a little bit, actually. And the general trend has been that the more time Obama has spent in a state, the better he does. Right. I think Clinton has lost her primary rationale for election, which was inevitability.
There's such an interesting contrast with the 2004 election, where Kerry was inevitable after Iowa and then just charged through and destroyed all competition. And this one, where that hasn't really happened, right? The support for both of the candidates has remained solid to some degree.
But again,
maybe you're right that Super Tuesday is going to break that.
Yeah. But I think it's actually different. I think Clinton has already hit... It's in some ways a parallel to the fundraising story, because Clinton has hit her ceiling. I don't think she can generate more support unless, people drop out. Whereas I think Obama actually, hasn't hit his ceiling yet. And also, Obama was smart and actually advertised for the Super Bowl, so I thought that was another...
It was local advertising.
It was local. He apparently saved a bundle. Instead of buying from Fox, he actually bought from, local... places. We saw the ad. I don't know if you did, but
no, I missed it.
It was a nice.
I don't know how I missed so many ads. I watched most of them. I guess it was folding close or something.
And on the GOP side, I'm with you. I think my suspicion is that Romney will do a little better than anticipated, but it doesn't matter because it's winner take all on the GOP side. So McCain is going to wrap up the delegates. And I think again the other thing that'll happen after Super Tuesday is how the superdelegates behave on the Democratic side.
Right, and some people have been talking about the Kennedy. The Kennedy endorsement in particular as being an indication not so much to the voters of Massachusetts, but to the superdelegates. Yeah. Right. Well, that this is a move against, against the Clinton hold on superdelegates.
Right, and what was interesting to me was that even after Clinton won New Hampshire, the next day, Kerry, Tim Johnson, and a few other senators came out in favor of Obama, and that was striking. That they still did that even though Clinton had won New Hampshire, because you could have penned an inevitability story after that point. And yet it didn't happen. So
here's another prediction or question. Okay. Whether you want to predict. How long does it take Richardson and Edwards to endorse, and who are they going to endorse?
That's an interesting question. I mean, you would think Edwards would have endorsed... I mean, Edwards is clearly more sympathetic to Obama. I mean, at least if you saw from the debates. But the fact that he hasn't done it yet suggests to me that they're basically waiting for a moment where it seems clear one or the other is going to actually surge ahead. And so if Super Tuesday is fought to a draw, I think they stay out of the race. If Obama beats expectations, it wouldn't shock me then if they come out in favor of him.
Right, and I think that's especially true of Richardson, because I think Richardson...
Well, he's clearly really gunning for the VP slot. Yeah.
Right.
Now that's about all right. Let's close this by going really far out on a limb.
Okay.
Who do you think the vice president's going to be? Who do you think are the vice president's going to be on either side?
Well, okay. If Hillary wins the nomination, Wesley Clark seems plausible. If Obama, then Richardson. On the Republican side, I don't have any idea.
Yeah.
I can't even broker, a suggestion. I don't even know.
On the Republican side, I think my hunch would actually be that it would be Charlie Crist from Florida.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
Because, among other things, McCain owes him one now.
Right.
And also, he's a popular governor, and it would... if Florida's a key state. So that would be my prediction on the GOP side. On the Democratic side, if it's Obama, my prediction... I don't think it would be Richardson. I'm not sure who would be. I'm trying to think other possibilities. My guess is he would pick a governor.
So, Sebelius has been, or Napolitano, is that?
Maybe Napolitano. That would be interesting, actually, because it would be from the West, and it would put Arizona into play.
Right. It depends on who he wants to be. It's an interesting choice between Richardson and Napolitano, and Napolitano has probably less baggage.
Richardson's got a fair amount of personal baggage, so I would have to go with Napolitano on that one.
Mm-hmm.
If it's Clinton... It actually wouldn't shock me if it's Clinton that she picks Edwards.
That's interesting too.
That would, because then that would sort of solidify her sort of base on the left, and allow her to sort of move forward. And it would, I think it would be fitting of the kind of campaign Clinton's going to run.
Right.
All right.
Well, I think that's it.
Well, with that, thanks, Rob. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, take care.
All right, bye-bye.